All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Today we have a little bit of a different type of video. As you saw in the title, this will be me and Mangler going over Death of the Author, which has become rather popular in power scaling circles for, I don't know, past year and a half-ish,
Maybe two, depending
give it
on
2 years.
the
So,
yeah.
for those of you who are unfamiliar with Death of the Author, we will be reading the entirety of Death of the Author in this video and going over it when we see fit. But yeah, so if you've never read Death of the Author, which, let's be frank, probably most of you have not, you will be hearing it in its entirety probably for the first time today.
Yes. For copyright purposes, we're probably not going to showcase it, but when you find it, you can probably look it up somewhere. It's only about 8 pages. It
Yes.
doesn't. It's not really that big.
It is not
So
a long piece of text, despite how popular people talk about it. It's not long. It is free. I'm looking at it on a free website, archive.org. I just don't feel like showing it because, ironically, Death of the Author is still under the author's copyright.
yeah, we'll get into that when we finish the essay, because we
Yes.
will also have a section we're going to talk about where we talk about how this affects its usage of it, its meaning, copyright law, and ownership, as well as visual media, because those are also very, very important to how this is being used by power scalers,
Yes.
as well as its original meaning.
Yes. So, with that out of the way, we will get started with reading it. We will break it down when we need to actually like criticize it or talk about it. So, also forgive any mispronunciations, but it shouldn't really affect the meaning of it. It is a little bit older. Sí, ahorita no hago nada, pero cuando pienso la música, tienes que bajar y luego subirlo cuando se acaba la música. Okay.
That
In
is not
his
part of the essay.
That is not part of the essay. Now, anything in Spanish will not be a part of the essay.
This is a French essay translated to English. I assure you, there's no Spanish
Yes,
here.
there's nothing Spanish about it. So, in his story, Saracen Balzac, Balzac? I'm sorry,
Balzac.
it's Balzac.
It's Balzac. Like,
Balzac. Okay, yeah,
oh,
that was not meant to be a joke. It is I suck at pronunciation. Describing a castrato disguised as a woman, writes the following sentence. This was woman herself, with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive worries, her impetuous boldness, her fussings, and her delicious sensibility. Who is speaking thus? Is it the hero of the story, bent on remaining ignorant of the castrato hidden beneath the woman? Is it Balzac, the individual furnished by his personal experience with a philosophy of women? Is it I'm just gonna call him B for the purposes of this. I feel like I'm gonna keep mispronouncing it. Is it B, the
yeah,
author professing what?
yeah. I think that's probably. I feel like we're probably mispronouncing it because that one's. Just kidding.
There is no like ill intent here. I just really suck at pronouncing shit. Is it B, the individual furnished by his personal? Oh, I already read that part. Furnished by his personal experiences with a philosophy of women. Is it B, the author professing literary ideas on femininity? Is it universal wisdom, romantic psychology, or yeah, romantic psychology? We shall never know for the good reason that writing is the destruction of every voice, of every point of origin. Writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where our subject slips away, the negative where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body writing. So,
Mm.
uh,
I
uh,
do. Do you have any thoughts you want to give on that? Because I have a couple.
you'll go ahead and go first because you'll probably have more to talk about, and then mine will be a little more direct, little simpler, ironically, given I'm the English teacher.
So first of all, um, he's basically arguing we can never really know definitively who's speaking. The problem is that the more you break down sentences and words and you understand how a language works, the harder it is to argue that position, except out of a disingenuous position. So when you say this was the woman herself with the sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive worries, her boldness, her fearings, her delicious sensibility, you would usually assert that that's coming from a third person universal perspective. So it can sometimes, we'll usually refer to the omniscient narrator, but sometimes it can precede a character. So this depends entirely on the words around this. I'm not familiar with this particular story, but if there's another character that's preceding or coming after that, that would indicate who's speaking. We don't just simply suspend all of our knowledge on the subject because a certain set of sentences doesn't directly indicate who's talking. A lot of stories are shot from a third person perspective. I have some other
Yes.
stuff, but I'll examine.
To piggyback off of Mangler's position here for a minute, yeah, if you're reading a book, you are not going to have this question as to who's saying it because by the time you get anywhere into a book, you will know there is a narrator, there are characters, you will know what the narrator knows, how much they know, you'll know what the characters know, how much they know, and you'll also be directly aware of whose thoughts you're in almost 90% of the time. Like, there are some stories where it is a little more abstract, but I guarantee you, for the purposes of this example, if you were to find this actual quote in the book, you would probably know exactly who's saying it within the context of the book. There's not some outsider perspective here. Although I guess that's what he's kind of going for, is that is the author actually saying it or the like character or narrator is? But like for the purposes of literary, we would just assume the narrator is most of the time in a sentence like this.
This is also kind of a bit difficult to understand because we don't know what like story he's actually pulling this from. And it's also one of the reasons why I don't go over the rest of the messages afterwards, because almost everything about this example can just be answered from the context of where the text is presenting. Because as Zim mentioned, depending on the chapter, depending on where you're reading, they will just tell you who is doing the narrating. It's very simple.
Yes, it is. It is
It's
nowhere
not
near as
it's nowhere near as
mysterious.
complicated as he makes it. Like he's making it sound like it's this universal, like, can we truly know the nature of the universe? It's like, bro, you're reading a novel. That's the point of the novel. Like, unless they didn't tell you this, which generally only happens if a novel is intended to focus on something being ambiguous, you weren't paying attention.
So, to be clear, we did not try and find where this quote was from, even though we could, because that would
We
go
don't know where
against the
we
spirit
don't know where it's
of the
from.
text of this essay, which claims that we
Yeah.
shouldn't have to know any background information to appreciate,
Yes.
understand text. So we will not be doing that for things
Mm-mm.
we don't know
We
about.
won't. We will go. We will go with his position, which is that we don't need to know anything about the text. Which
We don't exist prior to the. We don't exist prior to this text. This text is talking to a blank
uh,
canvas, which is us.
I got some problems with that interpretation. Oh boy.
All right. Now, yes. Beyond that, let us continue. No doubt it has always been that way. As soon as a fact is narrated, no longer with a view to acting directly on reality, but intransitively, that is to say, finally outside of any function other than that of the very practice of the symbol itself, this disconnection occurs. The voice loses its origin, the author enters into his own death, writing begins. The sense of this phenomenon, however, has varied. In ethnographic societies, the responsibility for a narrative is never assumed by a person, but by a mediator, shaman, or relator whose performance, the mastery of the narrative code, may possibly be admired, but never his genius. The author is a modern figure, a product of our society, insofar as emerging from the Middle Ages with English empiricism, French nationalism, and the personal faith of the Reformation. It discovered
Rationalism.
what? Oh, rationalism. French.
You said nationalism.
Yes, French
Rationalism.
rationalism. Thank you. And the personal faith of the Reformation, it discovered the prestige of the individual of, as it is more notably put, the human person. It is thus logical that in literature it should be this positivism. Yeah, that's gonna be as good as I'm gonna pronounce it. The
Yes.
the ep- the epitome and culmination of capitalist ideology, which has attached the greatest importance to the person of the author. The author still reigns in histories of literature, biographies of writers, interviews, magazines, as in the very consciousness of men of letters anxious to unite their persons and their work through diaries and memoirs. The image of literature to be found in ordinary culture is tyrannically centered on the author, his person, his life, his tastes, his passions, while criticism still consists for the most part in saying that Baldier's work is the failure of Baldier the man, Van Gogh his madness, and I know who that author is, but I cannot pronounce that Russian name to save the life of me. We're just gonna call him T for the purposes of this one.
Takeshi.
Takechki.
Takeshi.
Takechki,
Yeah, it's
his
cool.
vice. The explanation of work is always sought in the man or woman who produced it, as if it were always in the end, through more or less transparent allegory of the fiction, the voice of a single person, the author confiding in us.
Yeah, that was a lot.
So, right off the bat, let me cover that. He is technically right that the idea of the author is a more quote unquote modern approach, because people in older cultures like suits not soothsayers, but as he mentioned, I think what does he directly reference? Uh Okay, he doesn't reference a specific group of person, but like in older tribes and cultures, you would have people telling stories, but you would never attribute importance of the story to the individual. They would just be regurgitating stories they heard in the past, and that's why you have differences in stories and changes over time. The Greeks also had this too, actually, but the Greeks also, I believe, acknowledged authors as well, even though they also had a similar way of telling stories.
Yes. Um, he's kind of trying to remember what he says in this second page. As soon as a fact is narrated, no longer with a view to acting directly on reality, but intransitively, as if finally outside of any other function, the variable is a symbol, the six connected persons. The voice loses its origin, the author enters into his own death, writing begins. So this is kind of where I really disagree with this position, is that he asserts that the author dies the moment that the fact is no longer narrated with acting directly on reality. That is to say that it's outside the function of the text. This kind of doesn't account for like anything involving the creation or the making of the text. Because before you make a text, what do you do? Typically, like before it's actually released to the public, the final thing you do is you put a legal stamp on it, you put your name on it, you make it yours, you claim ownership over it. So how on earth can we sit here and assert that the author is asserting their own death when the last thing they do before they publish it is making it clear that it belongs to them and all the rights that ownership is entitled to, which does affect literature. Even if you think it's just a copyright position, that directly affects literature.
Okay, is it worth noting that this piece is still under copyright?
Yes.
So, as you're probably listening to this, hearing the actual piece being read, you're probably not quite understanding how it's got so popular in the power scaling. So hopefully, I'll be a little more clear going forward. Right now, it's establishing the history of authors and how authors themselves work, but it doesn't really talk about why yet. So, if anybody from the
It'll become more clear once we get to the final 2 pages where
yeah,
people get their
well, I want to
conclusions.
go through all of this specifically so you guys can sort of, for the first time, experience that of the author and understand what everyone else is talking about. So, if Mangler has nothing else to add for this section, we'll move on.
This next one is pretty long. Do we want to break this up into 2 sections?
We can break it up into 2 sections. Do you want to break it up into 2 sections?
Yeah, but I'm trying to decide where to actually break it up. This is not like a proper sentence break.
So, how about we stop it on so I'll read through half of 144. So we'll do 143 into 144, and then I'll stop halfway through.
Okay.
Though the sway of the author remains powerful, the new criticism has often done no more than consolidate it. It goes without saying that certain writers have long since attempted to loosen it. Oh, I remember this section. Okay. In France, Mallarmé was doubtless the first to see and to foresee in its full extent the necessity to substitute language itself for the person who until then had been supposed to be its owner. For him, for us too, it is language which speaks, not the author. To write is, through a prerequisite impersonality, parentheses, not at all to be confused with the castrating objectivity of the realist novelist, end parentheses. To reach that point where only language acts, quotations performs, and not quotation me. I'm going to call them that because I probably mispronounced them already. M's entire poetics consists in suppressing the author in the interest of writing, which is, this in parentheses, which is, as will be seen, to restore the place of the reader, in parentheses. Valerie, encumbered by a psychology of the ego, considerably diluted M's theory, but his taste for classicism leading him to turn to the lessons of rhetoric. Well, oh, is it classicism? Oh, my bad.
Classicism leading him to turn to the lessons of rhetoric.
He never stopped calling the question to writing the author. He stressed the linguistic and, as it were, hazardous nature of his activity, and throughout his prose works, he militated, in favor of the essential verbal condition of literature, in the face of which all recourse to the writer's interiority seemed to him pure superstition. Proust himself, despite the apparent psychological character of what are called his analysis, was visibly concerned. What?
Analyses.
Was visibly concerned with the task of inexorably blurring by an extreme subtilization the relation between the writer and his characters, by making of the narrator not he who has seen and felt, nor even he who is writing, but he who is going to write. So you want to stop there? You want me to go a little further? Because I think the sentence ends a little further.
We could probably stop there, and then we'll go further later. So I have a couple contentions here. Is when he starts bringing up Mallarmé, to point out that for him, he's bringing in language to bringing back the usage of language to take away the importance and the focus on author. To write as this, as he says, a prerequisite in personality, not to be confused with objectivity of the realist novelist. So he's making it clear he's taking a position that is completely against the objectivity of what we would be referring to, directly observing a text with empirical value, in order to reach a point where language acts, performs, not just me. So Mallarmé's poetics, as he puts it, suppress the author entirely, with the whole point of enforcing the reader. What does he say? There's a specific thing he mentions, which is, as will be seen, to restore the place of the reader, in parentheses. So I don't like this conflation, because Barthes is conflating the existence, the removal of the author with the replacing the reader, as if both of them are directly at odds with one another, as if the author is the primary thing that is causing problems with interpretation of text. Unless Zim would disagree with that.
No, that's what he's trying to say.
Okay, so this is objectively wrong. The primary issue with interpretation of text comes from a place of knowledge from the person who is reading the text, which has nothing to do with the author. It's all about your understanding of the language and the words that are translated to you. Most of the time that you're getting an outside perspective from an actual human being, you're not communicating to the author or being shown stuff from the author. You're communicating to another reader who also came to 99.9% of the same conclusions that you did, because they read the same book. They read the same words. They read the same context. They're the people that would be conflicting your position most of the time. And second to that would probably be the text itself. Because if you have a position where you're like, I don't know how to reconcile this, it might be because of how I understand a certain word, or maybe I understand all the words of the text, but there are parts of the text and details of the text that are completely contradictory to other parts of the text. Like, in no order are you going to come to the conclusion that the author was the one that was becoming the arbiter of this truth.
Yes.
Really. Like, the author is essentially employing this, like, this only really makes sense if the only people you're talking to just spend every 5 seconds of the conversation in like a book club just saying, well, I only believe this because the author believes this, as if that's the way that everybody who talks about a book speaks about it. They usually don't. Like, this position that he has only has issue with the author if you genuinely believe that every single person that you talk to about a novel would immediately invoke the author the instant and every available instant that the conversation and discussion of the text is taking place.
Yes. Which is ridiculous and absurd. However, that is a little more relevant to power scaling because every time death of the author is invoked, it is invoked specifically so that way author statements of any kind are not allowed in. And while they're not always in bad faith, it's mainly used because authors usually downplay their verse or something to that effect. Usually.
We'll get into the nature of author credibility later because that is technically a different discussion than what he is asserting. Because he is not asserting the validity of an author. He's asserting that an author just has no right. They have no right, and they should not be involved.
Mm-hmm. But I'm specifying that this is kind of the main focus point of why it's used in power scaling nowadays. It specifically just acts out the author the way that I was saying, but it does go into more detail a little further. So
I think we're about halfway done now. So
yeah. This is not a long piece of literature, ironically, which, given how much everyone talks about, you'd think it'd be longer.
Mhm.
All right. So
where did you stop? Who's going to be the man in the novel? Oh, yes.
yes. So am I on the young man or am I a little past that? Because I don't think I got to a young man.
Yes. I think you're on the young man.
All right.
Because you were
So
talking about the blurring and an extreme subtilization.
all right. In visualization, the relation between the writer and his characters by making of the narrator not he who has seen and felt, nor even he who is writing, but he who is going to write. Parentheses, the young man in the novel, excuse me. But in fact, how old is he and who is he wants to write but cannot. The novel ends when writing at last becomes possible. Proust gave modern writing its epic by a radical reversal. Instead of putting his life into his novel, as is so often maintained, he made of his very life a work for which his own book was the model. So that it is clear to us that Charles, I'm just going to say, but that's not how you pronounce it, Charles, does not imitate. I'm not going to be able to pronounce that. Montesquieu,
Montesquieu?
but that Montesquieu,
Montesquieu? No.
whatever. Mont, but that Mont, in his anecdotal historical reality, is no more than a secondary fragment derived from Charles. Lastly, to go no further than this prehistory of modernity, modernity. Surrealism, though unable to accord language a supreme place, parentheses, language being system and the aim of the movement being romantically a diverse subversion of codes, itself, moreover, illusory. A code cannot be destroyed, only played off. Contributed to the desacralization of the image of the author by ceaselessly recommending the abrupt disappointment of expectations of meaning, parentheses, the famous surrealist Jolt, in parentheses, by entrusting the hand with the task of writing as quickly as possible what the head itself is unaware of, parentheses, automatic writing, by accepting the principle and the experience of several people writing together, leaving aside literature itself, parentheses, such distinctions really becoming invalid, parentheses. Linguistics has recently provided the destruction of the author with a valuable analytical tool by showing that the whole of the enunciation is an empty process, functioning perfectly without there being any need for it to be filled with the person of the interlocutors. Yeah, I'm pronouncing that wrong, but I know what he's talking about. Linguistically, the author is never more than the instance writing, just as I is nothing other than the instance saying I. Language knows a subject, not a person, and this subject, empty outside of the very enunciation which defines it, suffices to make language hold together, suffices that it is to say to exhaust it. So, Well,
I'm trying to look up one of those words, but my link not
that's fine.
restricted.
So, to clarify,
Office TP is. Go ahead.
no, it's fine. You can look up. To clarify what he's talking about regarding the empty process of language, I believe that references the fact that when they were doing language experimentation, trying to teach people new languages or people who had never heard language before, they were able to understand things without ever understanding the basic language beforehand, implying that it was always there.
Yes. Because communication often can be completed even without like a verbal means. There are multiple different ways to communicate to someone.
Yes.
Look at, oh gosh. Person who takes part in a dialogue or a conversation. Wow, he could have just said conversationalist. There was no need to add a word that had like no utility there. What a waste.
Because this work always existed. There was no one who wrote it. England was just there.
Yes. I do have some issues with some of the things. By radical reversal, so instead of putting his life into his work, as so often maintained, he made of his very life a work for which his own book was a model. So it's clear that Charles does not imitate Mont, but the Mont in his anecdotal historical reality is nothing more than a secondary fragment derived from Charles. So whether or not the characters in your novel can be made or created from the author, or whether you derive inspiration from the characters that you made, is kind of irrelevant to what the meaning of the author itself has to talk about, unless that is the subject matter of what the author is discussing.
Yes.
Like, a lot of the thing is that a lot of these positions don't really make sense unless we're already discussing having a conversation with the author itself. Like if Zim and I are talking, a lot of times in the Discord, I talk to people about Halo, right? I've been reading through the Halo novels. So usually I will not talk about the authors oftentimes unless I bring up like their works or their acknowledgement sections. You know why? Because it's not really necessary to do so, but that doesn't mean that I believe the author has no right or has lost any right or any access to their work. In fact, I think the complete opposite. The fact that they can write something that is so consistent within and of itself means that more than anything, they have a right to their work and to speak on it. So, like, I don't think you get to just suggest that they cease to exist beyond this text, especially in an interpretation of how he defines like language, because he says linguistically the author is never more than the instance writing, just as I is nothing other than the instance of saying I. Language is a subject, not a person, and the subject empty outside the very enunciation that defines it. Suffices to say, makes language altogether. Suffices, that is to say, to exhaust it. Language knowing the subject and not a person. I disagree with that. Like, he's clearly never talked to me before. So many people who have spoken to me or any people who use English understand that English actually has many different types of slang. And that slang and various, not just slang, but people who are also bilingual, have the ability to use different words in a way that they were not intended by adding new meanings to them. This is often how new slang is created and how slang is also thrown out, is that people will interwove a new definition and a new meaning onto something, even something that previously had a new set of meanings. It can even be hijacked by a group of people. This can be in regards to a subject, but a person can also do this. So, yeah, I fundamentally disagree with that position.
Yes. So language is a subject, not a person, and this subject empty outside of the very enunciation which defines it. So now to clarify how he specifies that it is empty outside of the things that define what the word means. That's affected by people. A good example of this is mainly brought up slang. I'll bring up a more direct example from people is the word gay, which originally meant being happy, into a more derogatory slang, sort of slur, I guess the right word nowadays,
Yes.
and now just was a reference for people of homosexual tendencies. So that word changed over time because of people. It didn't change because of its subject changing. People changed it to affect the
Or
word. They're not absent of
examples
people.
like a blunt. Like blunt now is a slang for a was it a cigarette butt? If I'm not mistaken. Blunt did not originally mean that. Blunt usually referred to like blunt force to be able to hit something very like physically in an abrupt manner. Much like many words in the English language, they went over, I won't say revisions, but more so additions as a result of people messing around with the language. This is what happens when people in a country go over to different countries and immerse with different cultures and experience different ideas. They come up with new ways and phrases to describe what they're talking about because some people just realize, like, hey, I have this thing that I'm describing and I want a new way to describe it. Let's say this thing, and then it catches on. And then it catches on like a wildfire and goes through that entire group of people until eventually the word is being said.
And
And that's
yes,
generally, and sometimes you even have multiple pieces of slang in different languages that can mean the same thing. Go ahead, Zem.
no. I was going to say, yes, we know he talks about different cultures. We will touch on that when we get to it. So, anything else you'd like to add to this section, Mangler? Because there'll be more to talk about later.
Just to point out in general, language, saying language knows a subject and not a person. Not that language knows a subject more than a person. Saying that it doesn't know a person is completely disingenuous of what language's purpose is intended to do. Language is primarily based on the person because it's based on culture, which is defined by people.
All right. Let us continue. The removal of the author, one could talk here with Brecht of a vertible distancing, the author diminishing like a figurine at the far end of a literary stage, is not merely is not merely an historical fact or an act of writing. It utterly transforms the modern text, or this in parentheses, or which is the same thing. The text is henceforth made and read in such a way that at all its levels the author is absent. End quote, or in parentheses. The temporality is different. The author, when believed in, is always conceived of as the past of his own book. Book and author stand automatically on a single line divided into a before and after. The author is thought to nourish the book, which is to say that he exists before it, thinks, suffers, lives for it, is in the same relation of uh, anti antecedents to his work as a father to his child. In complete contrast, the modern scripter is born simultaneously with the text, is in no way equipped with a being preceding or exceeding the writing, is not the subject with the book as predicate. There is no other time than that of the enunciation of every text is eternally written here and now. Yeah, I'm gonna stop there real quickly because while this does break into a second page, I want to stop there real quickly because that needs its own section. That is just plain wrong. Several books are influenced by people's actions in their own lives across the board, and authors do spend lots of times working on these books for a good portion of their life and spending a lot of their own, energy to make this book happen. The book doesn't just exist randomly and always has existed, and the author didn't gain any knowledge or anything to make the work happen. A lot of these books are based on writers' own experiences moving forward, as they did reference, but they want to ignore. But this kind of implies that the author puts no effort into their books, and their books will just happen regardless of the author's actions or not, which is just not true. There's
It
no effort.
asserts basically a complete epiphany because it says in complete contrast to the idea of a father to his child, as if there is no nurturing state. Because he says it's not proceeding or exceeding. Like books typically can take weeks, months, years to write sometimes for people. Sometimes they can take an entire lifetime to culminate the ideas necessary or the experiences, especially if we're talking about books of nonfiction that are based on true stories. Like, but for the sake of argument, we'll stick with fictional ones, right? What about when you have a story that's based on an analogy? of something, right? That's based on perhaps an individual writing something as like maybe a war veteran, and they're writing a story that is meant to be an analogous example of their experiences, and they went through an enormous amount of PTSD and suffering trying to get a lot of their works out onto that paper, and they went through multiple drafts of doing this. Are we going to say that they merely just came to the conclusion they were ready when they started writing it, and there was a complete definitive process throughout their entire time? Because this also ignores the fact of competency. Like, you can have writers that can start a piece of work and completely leave it alone and not come back to it for years, and then they can finish it all. Or you can have writers that can finish it in like weeks. It depends on the person and it differs. But most people will usually have an enormous set of ideas that on paper might work, and sometimes they're successful, but sometimes they're not. Because there's so much variation of the human condition, you basically can't account for this. You essentially can't say, well, the modern scripter is just simultaneously being born with the text. The hell they are.
Yes,
How on earth is that the case?
because this also ignores, and I know technically the whole point is to ignore authors, but the people who write these things often reference inspirations. If we take this
Yes.
man's statement at face value and his position at face value, the stories would still exist the exact same way without the other stories existing or without any inspiration. Mainless
This
PTSD
also.
example. Hold on.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say Mainless PTSD example is a great example because there are plenty of war veterans who have written books specifically talking about their experiences of war, and some of them are more dramatized, but others aren't. Those stories
And
weren't just born with the baby who came out of their mother's womb, not the kid who was
not
there
not to
playing like
mention
tag in kindergarten.
not to mention before I go into the example I'm going to give, I'll just say to just add to that, if we are automatically assuming a distinction of time to how long it takes to write the book, we've already eliminated the idea of them being just descriptive, because different people take different lengths of time. By that very nature, the nurturing process is different, which is also true of any parent. Sometimes it takes similar lengths of time, maybe greater or less lengths of time, for people to be able to raise their child in a way that they consider equitable. Some people can do a pretty good job. Some people take their entire lives to do it. It differs from family to family. So the example that he gives is probably one of the worst ones because it kind of refutes his position internally. My example that I would give is the saying they don't have any inspirations. Apparently, Bartis has never heard of the existence of an acknowledgement section at the back of a book, because that's the whole point of an acknowledgement section, is to literally thank or to give thanks. Though sometimes I think it can be at the beginning of the book, is to give thanks to people who you think were responsible for helping you make the work that you are. Like, what? How does he feel about a book that was made in memory of a person who died? Would you, like, in Bartis's position, would you actually look at that person and say you're nothing more than a scripter that whose ideas superfluously came in when they literally say in memory of this person who's gone? Because I would argue that's incredibly disrespectful,
Or how about?
uh, along with being objectively wrong.
No, I was going to
Go
bring
ahead.
up, as you brought up the acknowledgement section, how about when they directly state this character was based on this person I met in real life? Like, this was based on my wife who I met in college or something, because there are some books where they'll reference this character was based on my wife.
Yes. Or sometimes they'll literally, they won't even like base it on the character and like make a new name. They'll just take their exact name and they'll say like, oh, this person is like my inspiration. And that's why I decided to honor them this way.
Oh,
Like that happens a lot.
very, yeah.
More than anything.
How about the times where authors are like, the abusive character in this book was based on my own abusive parent and the trauma I had to deal with growing up? By Bartis' example, that trauma doesn't matter. That book would have still been exactly the same.
Oh,
No,
it's loaded. It's loaded to say the least. The very
that's just weird
loaded claim.
because, like, yeah, again, look at any writer's creative process and you know this is fucking ridiculous because you see the amount of work and time they put into it. To assert this as valid, you would have to have evidence that modern science does not have that all of time exists at once. Basically. So when you get that proof, bro, I'd love to see it. But
That'd be great.
yeah, so no, this section in particular was just ridiculous in and of itself. It just asserts so much and just ignores so much context and so much variety in literature. It's not even like
When I read that the first time, I had to take it back,
it's hard to
look
believe
back at
that
that. I was like,
someone.
this.
It's hard to believe someone could actually write that section. Not the whole idea. This particular section with a straight face.
Oh yeah, there's more.
Yes. The fact is, parentheses, or it follows that writing can no longer designate an operation of recording, notation, representation, and depiction, as the classics would say. Rather, it designates exactly what linguistics, referring to Oxford philosophy, call a performative, a rare verbal form, exclusively given in the first person in the present tense, in which the enunciation has no other content, contains no other preposition than the act by which it is uttered, something like the I declare of kings or the I sing of very ancient poets. Having buried the author, the modern scripter can thus no longer believe. The modern scripter can thus no longer believe, as according to the pathetic view of his predecessors, that this hand is too slow for his thought or passion, and that consequently, making a law of necessity, he must emphasize this delay and indefinitely polish his form. For him, on the contrary, the hand, cut off from any voice, born by a pure gesture of inscription and not of expression, traces a field without origin, of which at least has no other origin than language itself, language which ceaselessly calls into question all origins. I'd like to point out that language has origin points.
Yeah, the entirety of the Romance languages would like a word. They're all pulled. They're literally ripped off of like variations from each other that are then pulled from Latin as a base. Let's see. He says writing can go ahead and talk about it. I'll just read through this.
No. I was going to specify. So yeah, the thing that questions all origins has an origin. Modern language today, its origins are in Latin, as Latin's origins, I'm pretty sure, date back even further than that. So, already wrong there. But hang on, let me find the section. If you have something you want to say, go ahead. I want to find the exact words.
Well, what is his obsession with first person? Because he keeps mentioning the enunciation of no other contents than the act which is uttered, something like I declare or the kings or I sing of the very ancient poets. And then goes on to mention the very buried of the author. Like, I feel like he just has a distinct problem with the existence of third person universal. Which is weird because he's supposed to be a critic. Then again, I'm not supposed to be thinking about his positions, of course. Was death of the author.
Also, this position kind of also asserts that drafts shouldn't exist either. Because again, if every story exists here and now, and there's no process, because again, he's removing the classical process of recording, notation, representation, and depiction, then by his logic, drafts would never exist, and whenever a work is done for the first time, it would be done, and that is the story. But as anyone who's written anything, literally anything, including school essays and shit, you all know that's not true. You're going to have to go through multiple revisions if you want a good grade, or your teacher will tell you rewrite this because this is wrong or this ain't right in some way, shape, or form.
They also teach you that because when you go out of this and you decide to write for yourself, you start realizing one of those English classes matter. Good example, when I write reference videos for the channel, especially for God of War, DMC, etc., I sometimes have to go through two different drafts because I realize there is more information I have to add, or there's some way I would want to edit it. I would revise it before I send it to somebody else to have it checked out. Or there's more information that needed to be added after the fact that the script got delayed for any reason. It's also not even including the fact that sometimes I can sit down and script for like 7 hours out of a day and get most of it done, and then just completely ignore it for months, and then come back later and have completely different set of words that I added. So by Barthas's own, by my own existence, Barthas's position is completely flawed and wrong. Because I can come back with new pieces of information that I will add into the script that would then be new. This also kind of rejects his position of like the origin point being the only position where it matters. Because if I'm making a new script, if I make a first script, then I throw that out and make a new script, haven't I now created a new text and by extension a new origin point? Have I not created a new body from which to read?
No, Mangler. No. Because language has no origin, and your work always existed.
I guess we're all just geniuses and we didn't realize it.
Also, I'll probably say this again later on, but to clarify, this is not fact. This is not a definitive law of how literature is read. As he brings up classical methods and the like, there are multiple ways to interpret text. This is not an end-all be-all. In order to believe Barthas's words or to adhere to them, you have to subscribe to this idea. So if you don't agree with this idea in premise, this means fucking nothing.
It means nothing, and it's also worth noting he literally points out that it's not to be confused with the castrating objectivity of the realist novelist. So he directly takes issue with the idea of the modern novelist having a more objective view of the text. So not only does his position require subjective interpretation with a lack of empiricism, you have to already believe in it for it to be considered valid.
Also,
which means, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I thought you were done.
I was just going to say, in general, that essentially means the only way you're going to believe in this is if it's being peddled around in a nice little package of like words and phrases brought to you by someone that you would be inclined to listen to begin with, which means it's just being framed in some way. Or whoever's telling you it is probably not being entirely accurate to its contents.
Or maybe they are, and they just agree with it in its entirety, and they think it's perfectly fine.
Or they could also be completely misinformed. But yeah, go ahead.
The fact of the matter remains is just the work doesn't really do things on its own. And also, I want to point out specifically that it's also not very objective because he directly insults authors, as he says, the pathetic predecessors. No, the pathetic view of his predecessors. Now, so he's got a bone to pick. You can tell he has a bone to pick. Yeah. He's not hiding it here. But again, by his own words, we would just ignore that because we're not supposed to look at what his opinions are. And we're not going to for this video because, again, we're going to try and keep to the spirit of it. But just keep in mind that kind of language and tone very clearly illustrates there's something else going on here. There's a bone to pick somewhere.
Yeah, there's a bone to pick. He's very aggressive about it, but by his own words, we're not allowed to assess that. So he's allowed to directly assert things in the text, and we're not allowed to question the meaning of that. See where this is? This seems kind of one-sided, doesn't it? It's like interpretations for thee, or interpretations for me, but not for thee.
And before someone says we're being unfair to the text or something, please wait. He'll directly, almost verbatim, say something to this effect in like 2 more paragraphs.
Yeah, just give him time. He'll bury himself a hole.
Hang on. Excuse me. Okay. We know now that a text is not a line of words releasing in a single theological meaning, parentheses, the message of the author God, but a multidimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. Oh, I actually forgot about this part, but I'll talk about it after we're done. The text is a tissue of quotations drawn from the innumerable censures of culture, similar to Bouvard and we're going to call it P, but there is a name there, I just can't pronounce it.
It's Pechush.
Pechush. Those eternal copyists, at once sublime and comic, and whose profound ridiculousness indicates precisely the truth of writing, the writer can only imitate a gesture that is gesture, like a hand gesture, that is always anterior, never original. His only power is to mix writings, to counter the ones with the others, in such a way as never to rest on any one of them. Hang on. Did he wish to express himself? He ought at least to know that the inner thing he thinks to translate is itself only a ready-formed dictionary, its words only explainable through other words, and so on indefinitely. Something experienced in exemplary fashion by the young Thomas de Quincey, he who was so good at Greek that in order to translate absolutely modern ideas and images into that dead language, he had, so Balder tells us in a book, created for himself an unfailing dictionary, vastly more extensive and complex than those resulting from the ordinary patience of purely literary terms. I will finish the next part and then we will talk about it. Succeeding the author, the scripter no longer bears within him passions, humors, feelings, impressions, but rather this immense dictionary from which he draws a writing that can know no halt. Life never does more than imitate the book, and the book itself is only a tissue of signs, an imitation that is lost, infinitely deferred. So, this man really spent a whole paragraph just say every book's a remix of the dictionary.
Yeah, he did. He also makes some. I don't know if Bovard and Pashush are intended to be like. I mean, he makes it sound like they're comedy. Like I don't know if they're actually intended to be comedy writers or anything like that. But if he's actually just making jabs at them, that's interesting. His only power is to mix writing encounter ones with others. Go ahead.
Well, no. I'll save this for later because I'd rather say this part when he directly references how text should be interpreted by a reader. So go on.
So he says that we now know that text is not a line of meanings releasing a single theological meaning, referencing the message of the author God, but a multidimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. The text is a tissue of quotations drawn from innumerable centers of culture. Okay, so by that logic, he has already refuted some of his previous positions, which is that he claims that language is connected to the subject, not the person. But if you think the text is a tissue of quotations drawn from innumerable centers of the culture, you're now arguing that the language, aka the meaning of how the text is presented, is connected only to the subject, but the text itself, of which you derive the mechanism of the language, is related to the culture, which is tied to the people. So he's essentially saying that the text is related to the people, but the language itself is related to the subject exclusively and not the person. So, how does that work exactly? Like, how can you make language that's exclusive to the subject and has nothing involving the person at all? So, as if you can't create a character that uses slang or uses different languages, which this happens all the time. It was literally happening the other day when I was reading to. I'm not going to spoil the contents of Halo Epitaph, but I'll point out that this happens a lot in Halo Epitaph. Like, there are statements where a character will just say things like IA or whatever, like a word that's never defined. It's never defined in the text. Never. It's not once given a single meaning. But you can tell that it's intended to have an affirmative because of the way it is constantly used. And even then, that's defined by the character's usage, not by the subject entirely. Because usually only one person uses it. But by Barthes' admission, that would not be true. That would be defined, well, it would be both true and not true, because apparently it's defined by the innumerable centers of culture, but it's also exclusive to the subject. Also, a multi-dimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. Are you sure about that? Because what if I make up a word?
Yeah.
How does that work? Like,
I'm not going to talk about this, but go on.
Like how in the world, like Aye is an example that I was using. That's an original word. That's never, like, it's only ever used by one character in this entire series. One time. How can you say that that's not original? Or at least that its context isn't? There's got to be an element of that that is considered original.
So, I know this is going to be a little unfair to bring this up, but how do you attribute this and this entire position to like one of the greatest authors of all time, and despite all my jabbing in the live streams, Tolkien, the creator of Lord of the Rings? He created an entire fictional language of Elvish, and I believe he also did Dwarvish as well, but I could be wrong on Dwarvish. But he made an entire language, completely original, for his own literary work.
And I'm pretty sure he's not the only one that's done that either.
No, he's not, because Star Trek also did it too with Klingon. Like,
I think the Dragon's Dogma did the same thing with some of the characters in there. At least that was mentioned to me, but I'm not entirely sure on that one.
Like, the idea that none of the writings can be original whatsoever is inherently false. Unless we're going to really boil this down further into like really regressive terms like, oh, well, creating a language is unoriginal because language existed before this happened.
Or that no ideas are original because I can always trace some component of something back to somewhere. Therefore, you don't gain any sort of quality or ownership or any credit to anything you do. Like, are we really going to sit there and say that, like, most, like, for example, if I talk about where most science fiction genres came from, like, I can argue Warhammer 40K, Halo, Star Wars, Star Trek. A good chunk of them came from Dune. Most of them were inspired from Dune. The vast majority of whom came from Dune's novels. There's probably some inspirations that were made for Dune, but are we really going to be like, yeah, Dune got everything from like this?
Also,
as if like, go ahead.
No. Well, to piggyback off your Doom example, going back to Tolkien again, a lot of fantasy tropes nowadays and a lot of things regarding fantasy originate with Tolkien. Like, even though dragons and stuff existed before that point, how modern society continuously views these things and uses them is based on his work. He is the origin of that. Is that really fair to say that it's literally just how does he put it? Where does he put it?
What about the cyberpunk genre?
In the
or something
gesture
like
that's
that,
always anterior, never original. Cyberpunk, exactly, completely original idea. Actually, sci-fi as a genre was completely original because there were writings back then that talked about technology and stuff. That was a completely original genre that popped up at one point.
Because this is literally a genre that you're talking about, whereas it is the hypothetical outcome of a future that is far advanced beyond yours. How can you say that there would end that at some point there wasn't some originality? Someone had to come to the conclusion that there was like freaking flying cars because they wanted to wish or hope for a better future, and they painted a story out of that.
If he wished to express himself, he'll at least know that that the inner thing he thinks to translate itself is a ready form dictionary. Its words only explainable through other words, and so on. Definitely. So, again, his position is like any idea is just an idea that already exists beforehand, but you're just doing it differently. And it's like, I mean, I guess that's entirely possible, but only this person would have had that idea to make it. Only this person did it. To argue the idea of a hypothetical scenario where this work would exist regardless of the author is just not logical. It's not the world we live in.
It is entirely possible that someone can come to the same conclusion, and it is entirely logical that they may have come to a similar conclusion or similar details or genre. The idea that they would produce the exact same set of ideas, that's probably unlikely. That's rather unlikely. Also, he says a readily formed dictionary. Again, he's kind of beating around this idea that a person sits down. He seems to keep thinking that the scripter is just this imaginary person that just sits down, reads and writes an entire text of a screenplay in one setting and then just fucks off. that's it. Like, he just sits down at the prompter and is like, I'm going to make the entire story. So
I'm gonna sit down. I'm just gonna write peak fiction, bro. First attempt. Let's go. And yes, while it is true to some extent of his position that like nothing's truly original nowadays, that wasn't always the case. It had to start somewhere. And the fact that it could start somewhere at all already disproves his position that nothing can be original. Even if it's a more modern take that he's looking at, his usage of older positions kind of lets us invoke the idea that it had to start somewhere. You can't say that it was just always there, because that would be implying everything was always there, but that's not how reality works. That's not the world we live in.
I mean, I hate to invoke this, but like, I mean, religion is an example. how many different religions on the planet do we have that all have different origin stories of how the world came to be, despite being in completely different countries with completely different cultures? Are we really going to sit there and claim that, like, well, some of them do copy off of each other? Are we really going to say certain distinctive ideas that come out of the other ones are not partially original? Especially when they come up with different identifying, like many of them have literally different clothes, different languages, obviously, like different characters, different themes that they have. A lot of the myths are different. Like, the sheer scope of what you'd be talking about is essentially asserting that this was all at some point sitting around. Like, really? Really? And what, they just wrote it all in one setting? Just got up? No. No, he's full of it. This is ridiculous.
The other fact of the matter, too, is like, if what he's saying is true, that these stories would always exist in the way they do without any other changes occurring, because again, the story always exists with the author, it would have always come through. Like, you would not have to argue again. You'd have to argue for things we can't prove. Because again,
Yeah.
by his example, going back to the war veteran who PTSD, who like writes about his life experiences in the book, he's asserting that that would exist without the person. We can't prove that, and we have no reason to believe that, because any logical thinking person would realize that this book is based on experiences that he went through based on choices he made. They weren't just preemptively programmed into his brain, so to speak, when he was born.
This also doesn't account for the fact that, especially when it comes to books written by people that have disabilities, how do you argue that when you have people that have specific disabilities that are exceedingly rare? How do you come to the conclusion that it's never truly original? Like, how do you assert that?
Yes, but also regarding the idea of, we know that text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, but multidimensional space in which a variety of writings and original blend and clash. No, text does have a singular meaning most of the time, because most words are not up for vast amounts of interpretation. But I think will be discussing that a little further. So
yeah, that'll be important later on. But like, just in general, saying text has a singular meaning, that's incorrect. Or saying a singular theological meaning the way he's saying it's incorrect, but it's important. We'll talk about
we'll
it
talk
here.
a little more about this, but just to clarify, most words in the English language usually have one direct meaning. There are only a few sentences and stuff where it's open-ended. There are open-ended interpretable things, but most of the time, if I write a sentence of a guy fucking drinking coffee, you cannot interpret that as him drinking fucking lemonade.
There are interpretations that we can definitively prove are wrong based
Yes.
on how the sentence is presented.
And yes, I know some guys gonna be like, "Oh, what if in the book lemonade is coffee or is a euphemism for lemonade?" Like, look, there
You
are
have to prove that.
context-specific things, but
Yeah.
generally, words have usually one meaning. Sometimes they have more than one, but usually there is one direct meaning. But we'll talk about this a little further. All right. So I'm just going to finish off the rest of this, unless Mailer wants me to stop like on page 147 and finish off on page 148.
I want you to stop like right before the edge of 147. You know what I'm talking about. There's
All
like a break at the very bottom. And then we'll finish the rest.
Once the author is removed, the claim to decipher a text becomes quite futile. To give a text an author is to impose a limit on that text, to furnish it with a final signified to close, or a final, signified to close the writing. Such a conception suits criticism very well, the latter then allotting itself the important task of discovering the author, or its hypostasis, society, history, psyche, liberty, beneath the work. When the author has been found, the text is explained. Victory to the critic. Hence, there is no surprise in the fact that historically the reign of the author has also been that of the critic, nor again in the fact that criticism, be it new, is today undermined along with the author. In the multiplicity of writing, everything is to be disentangled, nothing deciphered. The structure can be followed run, like the thread of a stocking, at every point and at every level, but there is nothing beneath. The space of writing is to be ranged over, not pierced. Writing ceaselessly posits meaning, ceaselessly to evaporate it, carrying out a systemic exemption of meaning. In precisely this way, literature, it would be better from now on to say writing, by refusing to assign a secret and ultimate meaning to the text and to the world as text, liberates what may be called an anti-theological activity, an activity that is truly revolutionary, since to refuse to fix meaning is, in the end, to refuse God and his hypotheses, reason, science, law.
Okay, so this I have a lot of problems, especially with the end of that, where he asserts that to refuse this ultimate meaning, you're refusing an anti. You're basically taking anti theological activity. You're refusing God and his hypothesis, and basically emboldening science, reason, and law. I would like to point out at the beginning of that paragraph, he claimed that once an author is removed, the claims of ciphertext becomes futile. To give text an author is to impose a limit on it. Text imposes a limit on its own text more than the author could ever do. You, words literally give more meaning to other words in the sentence. I don't have to be talking to an author. Like when I open up a book, I'm not thinking of what the author would do immediately. I might come to that conclusion over the course of the novel, but generally when I'm reading words as it goes, like every instance that words are being introduced into like my mind and being inferred by my brain, I'm thinking of what they mean at that moment. And what is limiting my interpretation is my knowledge and the text, not the author. While it is true that an author can impose a limit on the text, he's being disingenuous here. He is not including the fact that the text can do the same thing, and it does it to such an enormously greater degree that it's not even funny.
Yes.
Not to mention discussion with other people. Like if Zim and I discuss, as we have many times on this channel about like Devil May Cry or Darksiders or God of War, and we start discussing details of like demons and a lot of the things that they can do in their physiology, we are already agreeing potentially to a lot of the same interpretations. We have limited our interpretation by agreeing to things, by even talking about them, by even mentioning them. Even if Zim spends the entire conversation disagreeing with everything I had to say, and we can prove he disagreed with 100% of what I had to say, I changed his interpretation because I added more information to him, even information that he potentially could have known because he heard it from a new perspective. I have changed his total interpretation. I have added new finite details.
Yes. Also, text in general in any language is already limited by text itself, as Mangler pointed out that it kind of limits itself. But again, as I mentioned earlier, words have meanings, and most of the time they don't mean multiple things. So
most of the time they don't. While they can, the fact is that they're not usually using multiple meanings in that instance.
yes,
A
in
good
most
example of
sentences.
this.
Go on.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No. You give your example, then if I need to give a little
Okay,
more,
so this example pisses me off. Well, this example doesn't piss me off. What he says pisses me off so much because I just got finished reading an Epitaph novel, and the writer, the reader, the author is named Kelly Gay. She basically wanted to really depict how parts of like certain spaces, primarily the domain, exists in Halo. And she describes it so many times, like 15 fucking times, as infinite or boundless. Like, she uses the term infinite or boundless so many times. You cannot come to the conclusion that she thinks, like, you can't look at that and be like, well, I mean, do we really know the size of the domain? No, you can't do that. You can't do that. She says it like 15 times. There's no way. The text is limiting the capacity of other text. It is now going to be even harder for any novels in the future to claim that it's not. Because it was stated like 20 times in this novel. Right there. That's a limitation.
Also, I'll talk about this a little bit now, since because this video was predominantly made to talk about this in reference to power scaling as well. But this is very important here in regards to this and power scaling. In the multiplicity of writing, everything is to be disentangled, nothing deciphered. The structure can be followed, run like a thread in a stocking at every point and at every level, but there's nothing pierced. Writing ceaselessly posits meaning, ceaselessly evaporated, carrying out a systemic exemption of meaning. So this is the problem with using power scaling and death of the author as valid criticisms, is that the whole point of death of the author is not to diminish text itself. It's to get rid of any internal meaning that text would have. Let's use Kratos for example. Kratos is supposed to represent an idea of hope nowadays. The that sort of premise. This would say no. Anything the authors would want you to believe about that interpretation is just not there anymore. Any message, any theme the authors want to give you does not exist. If it's not directly stated in the text, or I guess let's say shown in the text, that theme doesn't exist. This is basically getting rid of any theme the author would put in, any symbolism the author would put in. None of that exists. Only the physical thing in front of us exists. So it's not trying to say the author can't tell you more about it, although it does try to pause that a little bit. It's more directly attributing the idea that any internal message does not exist because the author doesn't. Not that.
So the idea of nuance does not exist.
Yes, the idea of any nuance or any knowledge around a work does not exist, which is really ironic because to understand half of the shit this guy's saying, you have to know more about the shit he's talking about.
Because he keeps citing sources of other pieces of work. Yes. In order to understand his work, you literally have to go read what those things that he's referring to. Well, technically, you don't have to. We're doing it now, but
to understand completely understand what he's talking about and to completely grasp what he's saying, because I'm sure someone's going to say if they watch this video, you need to know about this in order to understand what he's talking about. That goes against his own work. That goes against the whole point of this. He himself should not be valid to understand what he's saying. So the fact that he keeps referencing other people doesn't really help matters.
Again, like, we'll get to this when we get to the copyright position. There's a lot of better ways. I think I'll talk about how he could have gone about this that would have made a little bit more sense, would have been a little bit more reasonable. Because I think he has a good foundation he could work towards, or could have worked towards, in more of a legal sense. But we'll get to that.
By refusing to assign a secret and ultimate meaning to the text. So again, while he is trying to deposit that the author doesn't matter, as I said before in our live streams, it's more so in reference to the things the author brings with him, not so much the author's word itself. Although he does obviously want to get rid of the author as a whole. Throughout the piece, you've noticed he's referencing not politics directly, but just referencing antics they themselves would do. He references the trauma of Van Gogh, I believe. He references, Ghost Madness, The Man, and people's vices. So he's not trying to get, well, he is trying to get rid of the author as a whole. His purpose for that is not specifically to get rid of the author's own additional things to their own sort of work or anything, because again, he doesn't reference sequels at all, but I think mainly we'll talk about that. I think we'll talk about that a little more after the fact. He's specifically trying to get rid of any meaning that person's life and their morals would have had on the work itself. This is a much more abstract removal of the author than what Power Scaling has boiled it down to, which even then, it's still fucking really bad.
No.
All right. So, let us finish off the legendary piece of Death of the Author. Let us come back to the Balzac sentence. No one, no person says it. Its source, its voice, is not the true place of the writing, which is reading. Bullshit. Hey, I'm sorry. Another very... Mangler, I didn't realize that you actually wrote the new Halo novel. Congratulations.
All right, continue. We'll go back to that one.
Another very precise example will help to make this clear. Recent research, again, there's a citation for something outside the text I would have to read to understand what the fuck he's talking about. Beautiful. Recent research, J.P. Vernon, has demonstrated the
constitutively ambiguous nature of Greek tragedy.
Okay. Its text being woven from words with double meanings that each character understands unilaterally. Double means, good. This perpetual misunderstanding is exactly the quote-unquote tragic. There is, however, someone who understands each word in its duplicity and who, in addition, hears the very deafness of the character speaking in front of him. This someone being precisely the reader, or here, the listener. Well, no, keep going. Thus is revealed the total existence of writing. A text is made up of multiple writings drawn from many cultures and entering into mutual relations of dialogue, parody, contestation. But there is one place where this multiplicity is focused, and that place is the reader, not as was hetero hitherto
Here
said
Will
the
said.
author. Yes. Sorry, it's because the text is a little small where I'm reading it from. The reader is the space on which all the quotations that make up a writing are. Did I lose my spot?
Inscribed without, I mean, I'll read the rest of it. Are inscribed without any of them being lost. A text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination. Yet this destination can no longer be personal. The reader is without history, biography, psychology. He is simply that symbol who holds together in a single field all traces by which the written text is constituted. Which is why it is derisatory to condemn the new writing in the name of a humanism hypocritically turned a champion of the reader's rights. Classic criticism has never paid any attention to the reader. For it, the writer is the only person in literature. We are now beginning to let ourselves be fooled no longer by the arrogance and defrasical, fratastical
Antifrastical.
reclamations anti-frastical reclamations of a good society in favor of the very thing it sets aside, ignores, smothers, or destroys. We know that in order to give writing its future, it is necessary to overthrow the myth. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. That's where the name essentially comes from.
Yes. Oh,
So,
to be clear,
oh,
it is referred to as the death of the author, the entire essay. But yes.
yes, but that is where the namesake comes. Roll credits. He actually did well. But this obviously has the highest amount of problems I think out of the entire essay because this is where the namesake comes from. This is where the power skill is coming. You look at this and like, oh, now I understand. I'm like, no, okay. So, Zem, I believe you had something you wanted to say about that first set of sentences.
Oh yeah, it's what's not true place of the writing, which is reading. Yeah, that is that is literally just blatantly false. Muhed, just like I don't know if you've ever realized this when you're reading a book, but you're not performing the act of writing. You're not putting words onto paper. You are holding a book in your hand, reading text that's already on there. The words don't magically appear the further you scroll through the book. It's not like a Harry Potter map or something where text just randomly appears. It's already there. You're not
It's
writing
almost
anything.
it's almost like he makes it seem as if people just read something and then they go and make a YouTube video and then influence the entire demographic of readers, which or has I guess YouTube wouldn't exist at this time, but like it's as if he assumes there's a public source forum where people are going out and spreading their views of something that then shapes everything else, but is all formed through a reading perspective and not a writing perspective. Like as
Yes.
if we all share a collective knowledge data bank. What in the world
Because
is he
again, there
smoking?
like just to provide a counterexample here, there are people who live lives talking to almost nobody because they don't want to, who have read hundreds of books. But according to this, they would have written those books. Because just by reading it, you are writing it, which is it's just so stupid. They're two
He
completely
also cites
different.
Jean-Pierre Verdant
Yes.
as one of his sources in recent research. So automatically, he kind of contradicts the positions that is mentioned because he's granted he's sourcing it because it's part of a work. You do technically have to legally source some things, but the fact that he has to bring an outside example at all is directly against what he believes
And
because
also
he's
just
adding something outside the body of the text.
to clarify as well, while it's clear he's referencing stories to some extent, he does make broader tones of literature as a whole, which would include this writing, which means that him doing this at all contradicts what his position is supposed to be, that you don't need outside knowledge to understand the text or to like properly read it. But again, this is the author inserting their own position into things, which is something he's opposed to or believes shouldn't be valid.
Yeah, then we also have, I'd say there's like three more things we can go over here that are a problem. But the next paragraph where he says, thus is revealed the total existence of writing. The text is made up of multiple writings drawn from many cultures, entering into mutual relations of dialogue, parody, contestant. But there is one place where this multiplicity is focused, and that place is the reader, not, as was here though said, the author. That is false. That is completely false. The entire reason you even have an interpretation at all is because the author created the basis for you to have one by making the book. They didn't just pull that out of their ass. Like,
Yes.
they had, like, you understand that writing as a process it isn't just enough for you to know. But, like, for the example that I would give, that I mentioned previously, a army vet who has PTSD, it isn't just enough for him to come to the conclusion that he needs to be comfortable to write that and put that into words and get inspiration. He needs to know how to write in general. He needs to look up how a lot of grammar words in sentences, sentence breaks, spelling. He has to know the font size. He has to look up like how he's going to bridge the paragraphs from page to page. He needs to know what size what sources he's going to use, what his acknowledgement section is going to look like, how he wants to pace the novel, what he wants the point of view to be. This is stuff that you have to research before you make a novel. This is the stuff that you have to do. This is separate from the actual content of the book or the inspiration that you do or your comfort in writing the book or the pace at which you do it. There's so many elements that go into reading this. So for him to actually say, for him to have the audacity to claim that the total existence of writing, that this multiplicity is focused exclusively on the reader, not mostly on the reader, which would still be wrong, but a little bit more acceptable, exclusively on the reader and not on the writer. Oh, that ticks me off.
Yes.
That's so disrespectful.
It's not only disrespectful, it's just blatantly ignorant because everything he mentions the reader has to be able to accomplish to properly read this work, the writer would have to do at bare minimum as well, if not more so. Because again, as Mangler mentioned, there are plenty of things that go into writing that aren't directly in the text. So right here, he brings up made of multiple writings drawn from many cultures and entering into a mutual relation of dialogue. The author has to do that too. That's not just the reader doing it. Let's see, a parody.
I can give an example, but before you go in, like everybody is familiar with the Call of Duty Zombies maps, right? Okay, so you remember the Der Eisendrache map from Black Ops 3? You know where that's taken from? That's taken directly from the Austrian Alps, from Eagle's Nest, because it's supposed to be pulled, as the story takes place during World War II, it's supposed to be pulled from Hitler's hideout. Explain to me how the author makes that map without going to Eagle's Nest. Because it's an exact damn replica of Eagle's Nest. How would they do that? How would they make an almost perfect replica of Eagle's Nest without going to that place in the Austrian Alps and visiting it, which currently is a tourist site, somewhere where Treyarch would legally be able to go, take pictures, and use it as a canvas to make their zombies map, something that they do for a lot of their places. Explain to me how they would do that. They would just magically come to the same conclusion of the same dimensions of the same castle without visiting it.
And again, to clarify, provide a more to provide an abrupt idea, is that in order to believe this premise is even remotely feasible, let alone has any validity to it at all, you have to believe that the author literally shuts off everything about their existence, proceeds to type out the entirety of the book, as Mangler has mentioned, or something to that effect, and then their brain just returns back to normal, and everything that makes them a reader is now 100% valid again.
As if they're basically being what's the term for what's the term used to apply to a jury when a jury is being excused?
You have to be impartial, I think.
No. It is when a jury is being excused to a separate location for a major criminal trial. You know what I'm referring to?
I know what you're referring to, where they're like they're sort of like you can't look at anything else, you can't see anything else, you can't examine anything else.
For context, when most major criminal courts happen, juries, especially in high-profile cases, they're not excused. They are relocated to a separate location, usually a motel or somewhere, where they are put under heavy guard and they are not allowed access to internet devices or major amounts of media. God, I don't know the tip of my tongue. What the hell is the word? And they don't really get access to anything. And this is something that happened, as an example, in the O.J. Simpson case, because he was a major, not just actor but football player. The jury had to be.
The jury had to have no outside influence or knowledge of the events
Yes,
preceding their
in
court
order
case.
to allow in order to allow a partial jury, you're literally talking about a guy that's like a famous actor and football player. So in order to make it partial, you have to completely eliminate them from society in a manner where they cannot be influenced by newspapers, the internet, TV, any sort of internet at all. It's some term, but the point that I'm making is that like it's essentially what's in. Imagine the author, under his interpretation, has to completely write out the entire, turn off his brain, write out the entirety of the script without any knowledge of anything, as if he's completely separated off from society, and he just does it immediately without any knowledge of the subject matter at all, and then just turns his brain back on, doesn't know what's happening, and I guess that's the author that Barthes thinks exists.
The author's just a Chad who, with no concept of reality, is able to perform works of incredible writing.
Like, God, I didn't realize that every single author on the planet was literally like fucking brainy or something. It's incredible.
Also, this kind of does, as Mangler referenced a little earlier, but this doesn't work if you write for a series you yourself did not create or have any hand in. So to go off the
Yes.
example Mangler brings up with the Halo novel, the writer of the recent novel did not create Halo in any capacity.
No. So Kelly Gay was only involved in the Ace of Spades trilogy, which was created at the latest 2016. Halo's been around since like 2000. Okay. She wasn't even the original series authors, like Eric Nolan. She wasn't a part of Bungie. She wasn't even a part of 343 because Bungie 343 typically have to hire independent authors to come work on their stuff. Granted, they create a lot of details and they're given an outline. But the fact is that they have to be brought in by those companies. And this is even going into the fact that like we have other examples like DC or Marvel Comics. Like, how do you account for things where you have like characters that are or writers that are hired on for both sides, where they hire them on for a comic line for like 6 weeks to write nothing but a single character that they've never written before that they didn't create? Because there are plenty of authors that have written for Spider-Man, but they didn't create Spider-Man. Stan Lee made Spider-Man.
Well, yeah,
but most of the authors of Spider-Man are not Stan Lee.
John Ditko. Go on.
Sorry, what?
No. I was just referencing. I believe his name is Steve Ditko, the co-creator of Spider-Man.
Yeah. So
Steve
the point is that the idea they were involved in the process, but the most of the writers for Spider-Man are not the original creators, and that's the case for the vast majority of comics characters in general. But the vast majority of like major blockbuster series in general, like sci-fi, superhero ones, there are a lot of standalone novels where there is one author. That's true. But there's an enormous amount of popular series where that's not the case in the slightest.
Yeah. So that doesn't work in his concept of what an author is supposed to be, what an author is doing, because they would have to have the knowledge of the series they're working on in order to write for that series. Because
he also.
Oh.
Go ahead.
No. As Mangler told me, the recent Halo novel has a lot of references to other Halo books, and were not all of them were written by the same author, were they?
No. So I can tell you right now that off of the authors we have Kelly Gay, Troy Denning, Matt Forback, Tobias S. Buckell, Greg Bear, Karen Travis, Eric Nolan, William C. Diaz, Joseph Staten, John Shirley, Peter David, Frank O'Connor. I think I mentioned that Warback. And then it has two, because a lot of the authors do write similar stories. Most of them write like 2 or 3. But then there's also 2 anthology collections, which have like 10 authors apiece. And then there's new versions of like stuff that was added on to like new editions of them. But that's without even mentioning something I was going to bring up when I interrupted you, is that the acknowledgement section literally has Kelly thanking Greg Bear because she says there would be no Didac finality without the works that came before and what they are. The Forerunner saga has led me enthralled for the very long time, and it's my greatest hope that Epitaph has done justice to such a special character into the vast, complex world and unforgettable cast that Greg created. At the beginning of the novel, she literally says, quote, in memory of Greg Bear, you cast the light of the 400 Forerunner's ancient past and drew us all in like moss of flame. This is done in memory of him when he died in 2022. So, how on earth can he sit there and say this? This is not the only time this has happened. This has happened thousands, hundreds of thousands of times, millions of times with other works and other writers throughout the history of literature. How can he sit there and say that like it's just alluded to like one person, that the author is essentially one individual?
I was wondering why a different author wrote the End to the Didac, considering that someone else wrote the Forward trilogy, but now that makes
Yep.
sense.
Yeah, Bear unfortunately died in 2022. The novel was, I think, delayed in part for that reason, because it was going to release in 2023, but during development, I think he passed.
That's a shame.
Yeah.
So yes, but again, great examples right there of where this is completely fucking bullshit across the board. And again, to get rid of it is to boil down the human element to literally fucking nothing, which would go against what he's trying to do. Because the whole point of this
Oh,
paper,
and then
uh,
go ahead. Sorry, I don't
the
want to
whole point
interrupt
of this
you.
paper is to give more validity to the average reader instead of the writer. It's to provide focus to the more human interpretations of average people, not the one asshole over there who was smoking his life away and wrote a book about smoking.
Well, then I also take great issue with how he. The funny thing is that he spends this entire time making it sound like it's like a build up to explain the reasons why the reader should be considered valid, and then he spends a paragraph basically shitting on what the reader is supposed to be. He says the reader is essentially the space onto which all quotations that make up a writing are inscribed without any of them being lost. A text's unity lies not in its origins but in its destinations. Okay, did you just assert that they're essentially where all of the meaning of it comes from without any of it being used? Bro, it is entirely possible for me to read a book and lose memory of what was read. Like, have you ever read Aragon? Or, well, I guess he wouldn't have because it came after him. He's dead. But the entire Aragon series is like what 800 something to 1,000 fucking pages a book. Yeah, good luck reading that and retaining all knowledge of that. It's possible to forget the entire events of that, and there are 4 of those novels, not including spin-offs.
Yes, as you'll see, as you already heard, but as you'll see as we dissect a little further, there is an idealistic perfect reader in this man's mind as to what the reader is supposed to be and who the reader is. They just don't exist. Much like most of their valid reasons, just non-existent.
He clearly has like this pedestal that he puts the reader on, but then he insults them and puts them up there like, oh man, they can never be lost. Like you understand that like when readers read books, they talk to other readers about it, even if those people didn't read that specific book. Like I spend a lot of time talking to people about Halo, even if they don't read the novels, because I want their opinions on different ideas of writing. Because I think that's important to share information. It evolves the human experience.
Also,
they can forget a lot of the stuff that I'm going to do, even if they weren't readers. I'll forget stuff.
Also,
Go ahead.
listen to this line right here. A Texas unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination. You know, in order to get to that destination, they're going to hand you an object. Usually that's unified. You know, usually all those words are in a neat sentence, in some way to read. Almost like they're already in unity when you get them. Crazy.
No.
They
At
must
this destination,
oh, no.
he also says this part, which
Oh,
it doesn't infuriate me, but it just sets me off. There's smoke
Yes.
out of my ears. Yet this destination can no longer be personal. The reader is without history, biography, psychology. He is simply that someone who holds together in a single field all the traces by which the written text is constituted. Holy shit. I have never seen someone gaslight a reader so badly. The reader is without history. Bro, are you telling me that if, like, let's go back to the war veteran PTSD example. What happens if I'm a war vet and I read a novel about a guy being blown up into pieces? You don't think that's going to send imagery through my mind? That's going to be very personal?
And keep in mind,
Like, what if you're.
oh, I was gonna say
Go
you
ahead.
can attribute that to any trauma victim of any kind if they read the trauma on the paper. They're just not supposed to have that trauma or that fear anymore. No, it doesn't
I'll,
exist.
get, I'll give a simpler example, a tamer example. The Percy Jackson series or the I Am Number 4 series. Those are intended to appeal to teenagers. And there's a lot of scenes in there that are. There's a lot of flirty scenes. There's social contexts with a bunch of bullies. There's grading sections. There's a lot of teachers. There's just like social events. These are intended to promote things like anxiety, nervousness, a lot of gatherings, things that young people have problems with and constantly encounter. Are you seriously telling me that's not going to provoke any images in the mind of a reader who would be reading this? I really wonder if he's actually looked at the book or the index numbers of a book, because the reason why the books have index numbers that tell you the ages that you would read this is because they're telling you who it appeals to. If that didn't curtail any sort of history, I don't know what does. What would be the point?
They're meant to resonate with people too, and that's what those sections are there for, resonation. But in this particular situation, he's saying that there's nothing to resonate with. You have no feelings towards any work whatsoever, or you can't draw comparisons because you are nothing. The book is everything you are getting a hold of. Nothing about you exists beyond that.
As if this also kind of asserts that you can't get any emotional value from it, which is insulting to some of the best works that you've ever read. Like, things can be deeply personal to you, even if you have no connection to the person who made it, because it can just be considered a great piece that is very that fills you with thoughts of joy or sadness or whatever, because you think it fits well into the rest of the narrative of the book or resonates with you for any number of reasons.
Also, this is where I find it a little ironic that power scalers use this because, again, it specifies that as to be a reader, which is what power scalers argue their position would be, you have to have no history, biography, or psychology, meaning that you can't go into any work with any sort of thoughts or anything that would be giving you an agenda whatsoever,
Yes.
which is just false among power scalers, even
You
ourselves.
cannot go in. You cannot go in there with any history. So the idea that you have an outside agenda to interpret it in a specific facet or manner. So, very popular example. You kind of see this a lot online. Is that power sealers will see a word like boundless, and they will immediately assume, "Hey, that's 1A on a power scaling tier because boundless was mentioned." Like, under Barthes's works, all power scaling terminology would be pretty much invalid, like completely thrown out the fucking window. So under the death of the author, it actually invalidates so much stuff that you would be using. An enormous amount of literature interpretations, which is funny because he also believes there can't be one single theological meaning of anything. And yet, we are without history.
Bruh. So
We're,
no background
we're
knowledge.
simultaneously without any background knowledge, but we can interpret anything in any number of ways. Like, bro, are we just a blank slate that just obliviously comes to the conclusion of like omniscience? Like, that's just not something in this man's mind.
Incredible. Yeah, physical constituted, which is why the I see. Yeah, he simply had someone who holds together in a single field all the traces by which the written text is constituted. Yeah, again, this is still just implying the premise that freaking you will remember everything you get from it, but even people who have gone through, again, as Mingler mentioned, books and games will forget it over time. It just happens.
Even if they've gone through it several times. Do you guys have any idea how many times I've read the Devil May Cry novels? And I've directly misquoted things? Do you have any idea how many times I've read those damn books and I've still managed to find a way to misquote something or not remember every single detail of the text.
Also,
I mean, go ahead.
Also, remember how he referenced critics and criticism? Because he brings up criticism again, that classic criticism never paid any attention to the reader. For it, the writer is the only person in literature. Okay, this was, while a lot of, it's just, most of this can't be applied in a more standard definition properly because it's not focusing on what he's talking about or how it's interpreted. Because again, he's mainly criticizing critics as well, and the idea of how to criticize and look at literature, because he just doesn't like the fact that the author gets all the attention. We don't know why. We have no reason to assume there's any negative intent there, although we can probably assume something.
Well, we'll talk about his intents after we're done, like, breaking this down, but we're almost done.
Yes. But I think, unless you have anything else to add, that's
there's one more important thing. Though I was going to say, to add to that, classic criticism never paying any attention to the reader. It's like, why are you bringing up the general idea of criticism when we're supposed to be inclining everything towards the nature of the novel itself and the text? Usually, like, he should be spending most of his time talking about language and how language is used with respect to its initial meanings, and how, like, spelling and grammar and how words are formatted. That, like, he should have made it about, like, just, he should have made it less about literature and more about spelling or, like, grammatical structure. I think he would have had a much stronger argument there, because it would have been formatted better. Though that also would have run the risk of not being able to talk about the author directly. But then again, this entire premise is kind of shaky at best.
yes.
One thing I would last point out, and this is something that I think you wanted to talk about, it is when he mentions that it is necessary to overthrow the myth. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. So he basically claims that in order to create the reader, we must kill the author. Not literally, of course, but metaphorically. We have to remove the author completely in order to have
Mangler, you're assuming something that wasn't stated directly in the text.
I'm paraphrasing. You can share your thoughts on that. I'll give my thoughts afterwards.
Yeah. No, the reader and the author have two separate roles. The author doesn't intrinsically put a limitation on text. Now, granted, there are times this does occur, but even among authors, that's very rare and far between. Most authors who have an open-ended story, to bring up a more popular example, American Psycho, the book's ending is left open-ended, and I don't think the author's ever gone back to properly close the book on what actually happens in American Psycho's ending. Because in the movie, he does kill the guy, but in the book, it's up for interpretation if he killed that guy or if he killed a random person. But I'm not going to get into American Psycho. The point is, it is that these two are not intrinsically separate to where the author loses all value in order for the reader to be able to make their own interpretations and conclusions. Now, while granted, the author will assert things more directly and might say that outside of it, readers' interpretations are not necessarily always equally valid, nor are they always even valid to begin with. There are ways to misread text. There's ways to not understand things, and there are certainly agendas at play, especially when we're talking about something like power scaling.
I think one of my biggest issues with this, so I'm going to piggyback off the American Psycho point, is that a lot of media is presented in a straightforward manner. There aren't many stories out there like American Psycho, even stories that are based on, like, murder mystery, for example, like And Then There Were None. You might have actually read that novel once, but it's a murder mystery novel. You would not ever come to the conclusion that in the book, And Then There Were None, that most of the people were not being killed. You would not come to the conclusion that they were alive, because the novel literally points them out dying as the main plot and the main narrative of the novel, as it's a group of people essentially being invited to a manor to be killed, as announced to them at the beginning of the evening, because of the sins they committed in the past. And they're being set up to die. That is the plot of the novel. You cannot come to the conclusion that they're alive. You can't. It's literally against the text itself. But I could say that. However, I would be objectively wrong. And as soon as we acknowledge that, as soon as we can acknowledge I can be objectively completely wrong about a text, we've already imposed a limitation on the text. We imposed a limitation on that, and we've also asserted the reader can be wrong. So now we've asserted the reader can assert something horribly inaccurate, far more than the author could, and the reader is also more actively involved than the author after the creation of the work, because the readers are the main ones that are actually reading it for the most part. They're participating in the discussion, they make the communities around the thing. So most of the inaccuracies, most of the false interpretations, most of the misinformation that happens comes from the readers, not from the authors. So I don't understand how the birth of readers, especially if you have a community of people who peddle misinformation, I would give the Halo community as a prime example of this. How on earth could you say that comes at the cost of the death of the author, especially when there's multiple authors? Go ahead, Zem.
No, no, you're 100% correct here. A bigger problem with this essay as a whole, or this idea, is it presupposes ideal conditions of every possible avenue. Again, the reader having no background, no intrinsic motives or anything, just reading the work and that's it. That's not real. That doesn't exist.
The author being a perfect scripter that is just not original in the slight, or that authors in general are not original, and that a scripter just makes something on their first try and they just go.
It also doesn't really cover sequels or anything. It doesn't expand its ideas enough to cover everything. Because as Mangler himself pointed out, or as you've probably read in stories yourself, dear viewer or whatever, you probably read books or read stories that retcon themselves.
Or that reference or reinforce text.
Yes. What were you saying? You said something.
I was just saying they reference. They can reference to. So they can reinforce existing text. They can add quantitative value to an existing interpretation, meaning they can confirm that something is more correct and that something is also more wrong. It can prove that a reader's interpretation was correct and other readers' interpretations were completely inaccurate.
Yes, which can happen all the time across multiple medias and also
and
in power
does
scaling
happen
as well. Which this doesn't really work for power scaling. We talked about this before because there's one other major issue, at least for a lot of power scalers out there. This doesn't really talk about visual mediums all that well, or anything that's not
before we
text.
start that, I need to use the rest of them, but now we can start talking about the actual 5 things on the Discord.
I was gonna say, let me see if I can't pull those up real quickly. Now we've gone through Death of the Author, its entirety. But to provide a little example of tooting my own horn here for a minute, in Fist of the North Star, there used to be an interpretation that a character named Souther had intangibility because the way the manga was drawn, it looked like he was phasing through a character. But I asserted a while back that that's not the case with evidence and statements from the stories themselves and outside guidebooks, which actually I believe some people do reference guidebooks, but this doesn't really talk about guidebooks either. And we just got new information today that he does just fly through the air. So he never had intangibility. So people just interpreted it wrong for power scaling purposes.
So when it comes to visual media, I wrote down here that it makes interpretation very, very difficult to debate when it comes to music. Much similar to what I mentioned with the examples that I brought up. Barthas does not account for visual media. And visual media does exist, though it didn't have the same color palette back then as it did now. And I find this very, very odd for a guy that spends so much time emboldening the reader, because he seems to conveniently ignore the fact that there's a set of media that refutes his entire position, which is visual media. So how are we going to have an interpretation about, let's say, I'll give an example. Kratos, someone that I'd actually given in the God of War reference video. How are you going to have an interpretation about Kratos having, let's say Kratos, for example, having a different skin color? Normally he's pale, but what if I said that Kratos was actually dark skinned? Would you even be able to believe that if you have a picture of the game cover when he's on it? How are you going to come to the conclusion that he's dark skinned if you're literally looking at a picture of him that's pale? You're not going to be able to do that. You would not be able to visually do that unless you were literally lying to me.
And again,
You can't.
before someone gets smart about it and points out that, like, oh, well, those are the ashes of his family, Kratos' original skin was actually darker or whatever. The point is the physical interpretation of his skin as it is now, not technically what it used to be, because now it is pale.
I wouldn't need to even use Kratos as an example. I'm just saying that we have a visual. The example is to point out that we have a visual example of what a character looks like. You cannot come to an interpretation other than what's presented there. You now have to come to a smaller, congested interpretation of his visuals. And the more visuals and detail we have, the smaller your interpretation has to be in order to have leg room. Until the most of the core details have already been consumed by all the other readers.
Yes. So visual mediums inherently limit actual, interpretations, which would go against Bart's position of, like, authors being the only thing that can really limit it. So again,
honestly, like we did talk a lot in the previous reference videos about how like the authors do point to information consistently for God of War and the Pantheons, but like even without that, we have examples for stuff in the Pantheons that we pointed out in our videos that indicated the text supported this interpretation. With the sheer amount of visuals, you can come to an enormous amount of conclusions, most of which would be held by people around you, of certain information, like how Kratos' weapons or his powers or his abilities work, just based on the visuals, most of which would be supported by the visuals. But on Barthas's interpretation, he doesn't really present a medium. In fact, he seems to think that the text and the reader are the only thing that matters. He doesn't talk about visuals. Doesn't mention them.
Yeah.
It's absent. And there's a giant hole there.
Go ahead, yeah, said, but come on. Shush.
Then there's another point that I wanted to point out, and this is Zem's brought this up multiple times. Before I get onto the final one, the making of new source material, continuity, sequels. Okay, you literally cannot make the argument of death of the author under what Barthas would have claimed. Which, if you believe in death of the author, you would essentially be asserting Barthas's position with the existence of new source material, because this means that a author can make a work, they can create like a book or a novel, then they can go and make another novel that introduces new text and new information that actively conflicts with the old one. What becomes your position then? Does the old text cease to exist, or does it now encompass the new? And if you're taking the position that it encompasses the new, you've already admitted to the idea that the text can have a new text that is added onto it. Thus, the domain of the interpretation has now expanded beyond Barthas's position, and you are no longer arguing for death of the author. And that is just one element of it. If you believe it doesn't, then you must believe that every single novel exists in its own unique continuity, separate from the other. Which then gets into a whole nother... But yeah, that's wrong, but that also gets into a whole nother issue of like fucking problems with interpretation and just general stupidity. Then the last part, this is something Zim and I have talked about extensively in a lot of streams in regards to like various things that happen with like the modding scene, a lot of video games, copyright. So you cannot believe in the existence of death of the author if you believe that any individual has a right to their own property or the ownership of their property, which the author does. So, good example of this that I brought this up in the comments for the God of War reference video when I was talking about the idea of copyright and death of the author, because I made a small essay down there that a lot of abridged series on YouTube, a lot of like fan-made content is made with the intention and fair use in the public domain. It's protected under law, and yet a company can go out of its way to make a policy that directly attacks your ability to make fan-made content and can get it shut down and basically make it impossible for you to actually fight that. Good example of this was Gamers Workshop, the creator of Warhammer 40k, basically making it impossible for the fan-made series, if the Emperor had a text-to-speech device, to exist. It made it almost impossible for that series to exist. A more known example would obviously be CFS Abridged, Dragon Ball Abridged. It's still up on YouTube right now, but if you've seen this in the community posts and the constant YouTube videos they do, they talk about all the time how like they have to fight to get those episodes up on YouTube all the fucking time, because even though they're within the purview of parody and fair use, like they're literally under a legal premise to have the right to make this content that's simply abridging the original material. They have to constantly fight for it to have access to it. And some companies can just make a more archaic version of their copyright and just completely eliminate your access to it, which is what happened to the Emperor text-to-speech device thing. It's what happened with a lot of copyright policies. So what I'm getting to this is that if an author, if a creator, if a maker, very different from what Barthas loads as a scripter, is very loaded language. If a author can just dictate at the drop of a hat, no, you don't get to make any content with my work, are they not, by definition, contributing to your interpretation? If they can literally dictate your ability to have an interpretation. Now, that is an extreme example, and it's a lot more in line with the argument for the author being authoritarian, what Barth has argued. But Barth has never mentioned the idea of copyright. I'm just bringing this in as an example that there are probably better arguments he could have made. However, an author has a legal right to do that. They have a legal right to protect their property and their ownership. So are they not limiting your interpretation by literally shutting down your fan-made content? Because I would argue they, because people come up with a bunch of different ideas all the time for stuff in like various different fictions, and they make new content out of it. Anyway, Zen, you know, I went on my spiel for a while.
No. It's just that fan fiction exists as a whole. Copyright battles happen all the time with parody channels all the time. Well, Mangler mentioned DBZ Abridged. I believe the Bleach Abridged series literally has episodes that aren't even up anymore because of copyright battles. Like they're not even legally allowed to have them up.
Most of them are up, but if you go into Project Mouthwatch's YouTube channel, which is the creator for Bleach, if you go and check it right now, literally almost their entire community tab is like, oh, we finally got this episode back up, and just keep looking through it for the last 2 years, and it's literally just them mentioning that they have to battle for these episodes. If it was truly the case that they had access to even something that's, again, protected under law, if they truly had the ownership and the usage, if they truly had their free interpretation, why do they have to literally fight like fucking hell to keep it?
Again, this focuses more back on the bigger issue of just that a lot of artists' ideas just aren't present within reality and don't exist within our reality. They are applicable ideas that just they have no grounding anywhere. They have nothing to stand on, and they have no practical application outside of an interpretation. But again, they're not a rule to live by. They're not even cohesive amongst themselves for the most part. He just talks about an idyllic situation, an idyllic world that just ain't real. A lot of the shit he says sounds like fucking ridiculous. It's an interesting concept, the idea of ignoring the author, and it's definitely a valid way to look at criticism at like a work if you really want to just examine it for what it is. Because again, as an English major, I've had to do that for stories, and there have been new interpretations when we ignore what the initial intention of the author had for a work. Like in Macbeth, the girl kills herself at some point. I know you're shocked someone dies in Macbeth, but there's a literary theory, not theory, but like an idea out there argued by people that even though her death was meant to be sort of showing how I believe the prince is evil and twisted and how he's destroyed her, there's a valid interpretation of the text now that supports this as her taking action in her own life and being affirmative by killing herself. I might have referred to the wrong Shakespeare play. But the point is that interpretations can be born of text when you ignore the author, and that's fine. But it's not a golden rule, and it's not even a really solid one to work with. It's interesting, but it's not really all that effective or good. And even
It's
then, to top
also
it off,
not necessary.
yeah,
It's
no,
also not necessary. The
no,
main problem that Bartis makes is that he makes the claim that it's necessary. Like you have to do it. It's
yes.
like, bro, no, we
The,
don't.
the other issue too is that is as Bartis himself demonstrates in his own fucking essay, to truly understand a work, you do have to look at the person who wrote it or stuff around that era. Because again, Bartis claims the reader has no prior knowledge effectively. That's not how you can truly properly appreciate literature or understand literature. It's not a holistic view of the piece of material. Bartis is literally saying, we're going to cut out 75% of what probably went into this book just to get the book itself, and that's it. And that's hogwash. It's fucking garbage.
A
But
lot of these examples can be traced back to. I mean, I could give like 100 examples, but like Star Wars is the biggest one. Literally an allegory for the entire Vietnam War. Like it has so much imagery that relates to the Vietnam War, and there's other stuff in Star Wars like Andor and stuff like Rogue One that relates to a lot of presentations of how the military are presented with respect to like civilians. You have to have some understanding of media to appreciate that. Like you have to. And the enhanced, not only that, but the interpretations, I would argue, are superior. Like, why do we just get the elephant in the room out? A person who has more media knowledge, your interpretation is superior to a person who's completely fucking ignorant.
Yep.
You have more knowledge.
Yep.
You have more fucking knowledge. And if we're talking about a series where I've read like 5 books, right, discussing a character, good example, the Epitaph novel, and I'm bringing up again. This novel, I've said so many times, is the unofficial sequel to the Greg Bear Forerunner trilogy. Because if you read that series of novels, like if you don't read the series of novels and read this just after playing Halo 4, you'll get some of it, but there's a lot of it you won't appreciate this. But if you play like some of the games and read the 3 novels, like, holy shit, this novel feels like 6 novels packed into one. It's filled with nothing but collective references. It reinforces consistent information from other pieces of source material. You can't come to those conclusions or those interpretations unless you read those pieces of text, unless you examine other bodies of work outside of this existing text, which goes against Barthas's position. The full experience comes from examination of other things.
Yes. And again, that also goes into like you can use that example for guidebooks and the like too when it comes to power scaling and the like. But I guess to try and like tie this back in to not just media but power scaling, this really doesn't work for power scaling in general. Because even like the
No,
core
that's like
theme of it isn't really there. And the reader, as Barthas describes it, is not your power scaler. They're all looking for something whenever they're reading text and material. When they comb through a guidebook, they're looking for statements for power scaling. When they read a book or go through any information in the game, it's in reference to a goal that they have pre-established beforehand. So they're not even the reader that Barthas will be like supporting.
yeah, the people who would be supporting him are literally antithetical to his position. Almost all the power scalers have a tiering system that is written by a blog somewhere on the internet that uses specific words to mean a specific thing, usually axioms that they already accept to be true. The likes of which Barthas would not necessarily agree with. Barthas probably wouldn't even know what the fuck these people are talking about. And then these people will go into a text and be like, okay, well, I just need a statement for this, and then this character gets this, and this. When in reality, like that meaning is not even necessarily being derived from the text. Like, and from his position, you have to be without history or biography or psychology. It is very much an effective psychology for you to come in with an intention to have a specific interpretation. Like you've molded your interpretation by the very nature of this, but far more than an average reader would, because you have something to gain from it outside of just enjoying the novel itself. You have an additional ulterior motive, which
Oh,
means
wait.
your
The,
presentation and your interpretation can also be disingenuous.
does he say psychology instead of physiology? Did I miss say that?
Uh, no, he says psychology.
No,
He
so yeah,
limits to psychology.
I'm pretty sure I said physiology there instead of psychology. Yeah, so I
It would be valid either way. It wouldn't matter whether you said physiology or psychology.
so
You're the same thing at this point.
yeah, so even the reader that Bartis presupposes is not the reader power skillers are. They would be antithetical to this position, and they would be they're completely their existence in the way they interpret media is completely against what Bartis is going for. Even though what he's going for is already trash, but it's
It's
even
even more
worse because it
trash.
doesn't work at power scaling.
And the worst part is trash for two reasons. One, the power skills are against his position, but two, the reader that he asserts is without biography, psychology, or anything. So we're talking about literally the most unqualified person I can think of to read a novel. They have no history, no knowledge of biography, nothing. Like a person that doesn't even exist in this world. But even if they did exist, why the hell would I want to take their interpretation of the novel? Like, it might be interesting, but like, why would I take it as a credible interpretation? They shouldn't even know most of the words.
I think something that's really telling about the death of the author essay and sort of like mythos around it among the internet talking circles is that it really just gets boiled down to the idea that the author's word has no meaning and that's it. But Bartis's essay demonstrates significantly more than just that, especially in reference
He
to what the
demonstrates
reader is supposed to do.
he demonstrates the exact reason why authors' words actually have some meaning. Because I have to come to the conclusion. I have to know what caused this man to come to such an asinine conclusion. That is exactly why I want to know his position. Is because he says nonsense like this. Keep in mind, his position is that of a critic. And now that we're done talking about his, I mean, we're talking about this, but we've gone over. Like, his position is clearly one of a little bit of bias. I think he gets a bit aggressive in one of
Yeah.
the pages because he
No.
mentions
No, yeah, we touched on that. No,
pathetic view of the president. So just
he's absolutely got an agenda here, and he absolutely has a bone to pick with literary criticism at the time. And that's fine. But again, we have to presuppose that, and we could find out for sure if we probably saw more of his other work and attributed it to him directly, providing a more holistic example and a more holistic understanding of his work as a whole. But he disagrees with that, so we're not going to do that.
yeah, a more empirical analysis, a proper picture, if you will. But in his perspective, he wants an abstract example. He seems to think the only way to view a painting is just to slosh an ink blot on it and come to the conclusion that you can at the exact moment and instant that you see it and nothing more, nothing less.
Yeah.
Like, everything is a blank canvas to Barthas,
Yes.
only to be written once and never again.
Which is just blatantly false, as anyone who has created anything can tell you, or
I
fuck, anyone
really,
who has existed can tell you.
I really, really think that his analogy would have been great for discussing pieces of art, specifically like actual physical art. Like, maybe he could have actually written a great essay on that. But just to get my final thoughts on things, critiques that I think he could have done that would have been a little bit more valid. One is the means of ownership and the position of like an authoritarian author, because he does mention this, but I think his position would be a lot more fair if he was arguing from a legal perspective that the author can be authoritarian because they can essentially get rid of your capacity to have an interpretation. Now, while legally it is their right, it's also kind of silly that they can essentially just decide that at any moment no works or no material of their works can exist without their express permission, only until they die and enter into the public.
Yes.
That might have been a more valid position. I actually, that's what I thought the essay was about. When I first heard about Death of the Author, I was like, oh, is he talking about like works ending into the public domain? Is it a criticism of copyright? That sounds interesting. And then I read it, I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, what in the world is this?
And then I
This is not at all what I thought. Then I regretted my life.
yes.
Well,
However, on my end, a little bit, as someone who has done literary criticisms for college, again, I'm getting my bachelor's in English hopefully this semester. Um, it can lead to interesting discussions and interesting viewpoints, which is fine on its own. But that's not why we made this video. We made this video specifically because it's being brought into power scaling as a way to tell people who have spent their lives working on material and fiction and games, essentially, that they're not important. Their word holds no value. And that's just not, it's just wrong in general, but it's also wrong from the
it's
way
it's
Bartholomew here, or whatever his name is, fucking Bartis, talks
it's
about it.
objective. It's objectively wrong on just a factual level. It's morally and ethically wrong from both the position of a critic and the reader and the writer. It's structurally wrong with his own arguments, and I could probably come up with another set of reasons if I were to go through here. But like,
But
it's wrong for multiple reasons.
But see, having that
Seriously wrong.
interpretation is not necessarily a bad thing on its own. The problem is that a lot of these power scalers and people who show up on our channel every now and again uh, propose this idea of death of the author as gospel, as if this is the true interpretation of
Oh,
all literature, and there's no other interpretation that's valid or that works within it. And
there was
no,
there was
it,
one last thing that I need to discuss before we ended, in case
all
we
right,
were
go.
going to do that. Yes, you're correct. This is the important part, and just have to listen to this before you click off this video. Death of the author is not some kind of logical, like assertive, informal fallacy that you assert. Though technically, death of the author as a whole is fallacious. This entire thing is completely fallacious. It's logically problematic. What I mean is that death of the author in the power scaling is used the same way that like someone calls out a strawman fallacy, right? Where as soon as someone presents an idea involving the author, they're just like, well, I'll just invoke death of the author, as if it's like an accepted axiom, like it's a position that you just hold, that you're supposed to bring out at certain circumstances. That's not what death of the author means. This is an entire viewpoint on author statements in general. This is Barthas's complete perspective in regards to authors. So for this to be used by anyone, you not only have to believe it, you must believe it at all times, meaning you can't just propose death of the author if you also use author statements. That's not how that works.
Not
So
only
even if you were
that,
to use this thing, that's trash. You have to use it a very specific way.
And not only that, you have to accept all parts of it, not just the death of the author part. So you also have to accept that you have any concept or any knowledge behind it, which these people do not. They objectively do not.
Yes.
So they adhere to a policy they themselves don't subscribe to or actively represent.
For this to make sense, you have to have no knowledge of death of the author, which is entirely possible if you've never read the essay. But if someone has mentioned it to you, has already mentioned the details, they've already disrupted your capacity for the interpretation, to the ideal interpretation that Barthas proposes. So there's actually literally no way you could subscribe to death of the author as Barthas observes, as Barthas proposes it. It's literally impossible.
Yeah. Unfortunately, nowadays, people probably use a more derivative, degraded version of it to just say the author doesn't matter and that's it.
Yes.
But like, they also reference this essay all the time.
Yeah, that's why I said there's different versions of how people interpret death of the author. Death of the author nowadays is used more so in reference to New Age criticism, which we can maybe go over that at a later time or not, but like that's a completely different sect of like criticisms toward how the author should be used.
Yes.
This is certainly not what most people think death of the author means. They think most of it is just usually a logical fallacy that you call on your opponents, not a point of view that you hold at all times, where you just claim that author positions are not really valid because they infringe on text. And that's it. Everyone thinks it's like a paragraph's worth of information, and that's all this is. Trust me, 8 pages worth of nonsense is 8 pages worth of nonsense.
Yes. not worth the ink it's printed on, really. But yeah.
I think
At
that's
the
it
end of
for
the
me.
day, that was the main purpose we made this video for. We decided to go over Death of the Author just so people who haven't read it before or seen it can also directly hear it and make their own conclusions if they want to. Maybe something Bart has said actually resonated with you. But
Yes.
yeah, we've been talking about it for a while. We wanted to make a video on it, discussing our thoughts on it and going over it in a little more detail. And
I
it ended up being a little worse than we were expecting. I had read Death of the Author once before, but I think this was Mangler's first time reading it.
no, this was not my first time reading it. So I've read it twice before this, and I'd seen many summaries prior to that. This is my third time reading it. But it got way worse this time around. The best part of it was you mispronouncing the names. You getting the language wrong was the best part of the of the of the essay, which is ironic considering.
How dare you, Mangler? Language is based on the subject, not the person, but it's also based on
No,
the culture.
I would still recommend to anyone who truly wants to know it, you should read the original essay yourself and come to your conclusions. I'm just saying, like, we went over
Yes.
the direct entirety of it. Anything we said can be found in this essay. Anything that we were referring to can be found in this essay. This was
Yes.
also kind of requested in some cases. So for anyone who was looking for this, here it is. Enjoy.
Yes. So, we might make a live stream talking about a few other things around Death of the Author, but for the purpose of this video, this will be it because we were mainly focusing on Death of the Author itself. So, if that's all Mangler has to say, which I think it is,
Mm-hmm.
then, well, thank you for joining us for these 2 hours and 15 minutes. So, thank you guys for your time as always. Have a nice day. I'll see you guys on the next streamer video. Take care, everybody.